Hello everyone. Today I'm on my Ghetto Arcane Mage, and I'm going to talk about WeakAuras. If you're not familiar with WeakAuras, there's a video in the description that covers first how to install it, second ways of importing strings that you find on the internet, and third some examples of how I integrated it into the UI of my priest. So if you're not really familiar with how WeakAuras works or what it's for, go check out that video, and if you're still interested, come back. I'm on my mage because today I'm going to talk about 3 kinds of tracking you can do with WeakAuras. The first one is buffs on a player, the second one is debuffs on a player, and the third one will be abilities with cooldowns becoming ready or not ready, as the case may be. I think the easiest way to get this going is to just create a simple aura. So let's start by bringing up the WeakAuras config. You can see on the left side there's a list where auras that you've created will appear, and on the right side there are either options to create new auras, or if you already have one, the options for an aura. I think we should start by tracking a buff on the player. In this case, I'm going to do clear casting. So the first thing to do is to give it a name, and while you can enter anything you want, I recommend something descriptive so you can tell it apart from the 2 or 3 dozen auras that you may end up creating. So we have a basic aura, it's just a square in the middle of the screen. And what I want for this to do is to appear when I have the clear casting buff, and to disappear when I don't. Seems simple enough. The first thing I'm going to do is set load conditions. Load conditions cover when this aura can even become active. So you can limit it by whether or not you're in combat, the type of class you're on, what instance difficulty or zone you're in, as well as a few other options that seem pretty self-explanatory. In this case, I'm going to limit these auras to show only while I'm in combat, only when I'm playing on my mage, and only when I'm spec'd arcane. And that should be good enough to get started. The second thing I'm going to do is come over to the trigger section, and this allows you to set the different conditions that happen to cause the aura to display or hide. Well, there's a few different options. Today we're going to be focusing strictly on aura types. Aura is just another way of saying buff or debuff. So starting with aura, it wants to know what the name of the buff we're tracking is. In our case, that's clear casting. And you can see you can enter multiple different auras to trigger the same display, but we're only going to use clear casting here. The second thing to check is the unit, whether it's a player, your target, pet, or a specific unit like Boss 1 or Arena 1. In this case, clear casting is a buff on me, the player, and the type is buff as opposed to debuff. There are a couple of other options, like remaining time and whether you cast it or not. We don't need to set those. I'm just going to drag this off to the side, and let's see if we can't make that display. I'm going to start by just attacking this target dummy. You can see the Blizzard standard auras have displayed here in the middle of the screen, and it looks like clear casting is showing up when I finally get the buff. I'll just keep attacking this boss and hope that it procs. Seems like we're not getting very much luck here. There we go. You can see that I have the clear casting buff, and while that's up, the clear casting aura was displayed as long as I was in combat. As soon as I came out of combat, clear casting went away. So that seems to be working pretty much exactly like how you'd expect it to. Let's do one that covers debuffs. In this case, we'll use the Arcane Blast debuff that Mages put up by spamming Arcane Blast. While this is a player cast buff, it would work just as well for one stacked by a boss. For example, on the Syndragosa encounter, the Wild Magic debuff stacks as you cast spells. You could use a weak aura to track when you've, say, reached 10 stacks. So let's bring up the WeakAuras config. We're going to create a new icon, and this one we'll call Arcane Blast. Now we'll go back to the load conditions and set stuff that makes sense for this character. So I'm going to restrict it to in combat when I'm playing a mage and when I've specialized as arcane. I think that's enough. Now let's go to trigger conditions. And once again, buffs and debuffs are just auras, so we'll use that. The name is Arcane Blast. And the unit is player, and the aura type is a debuff. Let's try DPSing and see if we can get that to display. You can see in the middle of my screen here, there's an Arcane Blast icon. You can also see in the bottom corner, there's a small bit of text showing the number of stacks I have. And when I clear the debuff, it goes away. Let's clean that up a little bit. So I can click on the debuff itself, and let's see what we can set. The first thing I want to do is clean up that font to be more consistent with my UI. I'm going to switch that to Accidental Presidency, scale it up a little bit. The second thing I'm going to do is choose a custom icon. And the reason for this is just that the default Arcane Blast debuff is a little hard to read the numeric text, so I'm going to choose my own. You can just come into WeakAuras, and when you choose a custom one, you can search. Occasionally you'll come to choose an icon, and this will remain empty even when you type something. Just log out and log back in. I think that's a bug with caching icons. You can move around the text. For example, maybe have it displaying beneath and outside the graphic. And you can also zoom in and out on the icon itself. I think I'm going to keep this inside in the bottom left corner. Bottom right corner. There's an option to display this tooltip for the debuff when you mouse over it, but I'm going to leave that off. And there's some sliders to adjust the size. I'm just going to move this over to the side to make it a little easier to see. Maybe beside my clear casting aura. I think that looks pretty good. There's also an option here to show the cooldown as a spinner on the icon itself, and you can invert its direction. I think I'm going to leave that turned off, but it's a nice option if you're into that sort of thing. Lastly, you can suck the color out of it by clicking the desaturate option, or you can tint it by using the color picker and likewise adjust its opacity. I think for this I'm going to give it just a slight blue tint to make the text easier to read. That looks pretty good. Let's see how that works. So you can see Arcane Blast is stacking up and the number of stacks are much easier to read. And when I clear it with Arcane Missiles, the aura goes away. Let's go back into the WeakAuras config and see if there's anything else we can put in there. I think we should add a timer for the clear casting buff. So by default, in the display tab, it's usually set to text, or the text, is usually set to stacks. By hovering over the text field, you can see there's a few options. %P shows progress, which is another way of saying timer. %T shows the maximum amount of time remaining. %N shows the name. And likewise, %C allows you to enter a custom function to display almost anything you like. I'm going to use %P to show the time remaining on clear casting. There's a few options here. You can adjust the precision of the clock. For example, extremely precise, or just seconds alone. I'm going to adjust the font again. I'm going to make it match the rest of my interface. You can add a cooldown sweep, just as you could with the Arcane Blast debuff tracker, but I think I'm just going to leave this as is, save for maybe a slight color tint to make my text a little bit easier to read. There we go. Let's see if we can't get it to proc again. There we go. That looks pretty good. The last thing I want to do is replace Blizzard's Arcane Missiles display in the middle of my screen with one I created in WeakAuras. To do that, I'm going to first disable Blizzard's aura display, which you can do by coming into Interface Options, and under Combat, unchecking the Show Spell Alerts option. Now when I get an Arcane Blast buff, the Blizzard auras no longer display. There we go. And now I'm going to create another icon that shows when the Arcane Missiles ability is ready. To do that, I'm going to open up WeakAuras. I think I'll make this as an icon as well. We'll call this Arcane Missiles. I'm going to set some load options once more to in combat, when I'm a mage, and when I'm specialized arcane. And I think that's good enough. And lastly, I'll come to trigger. Now there are two ways I could do this. The first would be by tracking the aura Arcane Missiles with an exclamation point. And then I can come in and just adjust the colors and text to match everything else. Make that a little larger. If I click on these view circles, I can toggle on auras. I think I'm going to do that, just to line this up. That's a good start. Likewise, I can tint its color and choose a custom icon if I would like to. I think I'm going to use this one. It's a little prettier. And I can tint the color too if I want, just to make my text a little bit easier to read. So let's DPS and see how that looks when it procs. There we go. You can see the text here shows nothing particularly interesting. It's always going to have a stack count of 1. Let's adjust that. Well, I could put in the progress to show the time remaining. I think what I'm going to do is just put a space there to leave it blank. Now another way we could do this same display is by using a different type of trigger. If you come under status, you can see there's a subtype for status. It defaults to health, but there are actually a whole bunch, from your threat situation to your stances to the amount of mana and holy power you have. There's really quite a lot of options. The one I'm going to use is Action Usable. This triggers when a specific spell or ability can be used. It takes into account things like making sure that you have a valid target if you want it to. So I'm going to use this instead of simply checking for the buff. Arcane Missiles is the spell that I cast, and I'm going to hit OK. And I'm also going to check this Required Valid Target option. So if I close this, let's see how it looks. You can see when Arcane Missiles procced, it appeared once again. As long as I stay in combat, I can click on myself and make the aura disappear because I'm not a valid target. When I cast Arcane Missiles, the aura goes away.